The morning started the same way it had for the last 20 years. Coffee steaming on the porch rail, boots resting on the second step, and the low hiss of sprinklers coming from the new subdivision that had slowly crept across what used to be cornfields. Walt Henderson liked the sound of the water hitting the grass. It reminded him of rain on a tent, steady and simple. His 3 acres sat like an island in a sea of manicured lawns and HOA-approved flower beds. The last patch of honest dirt in what locals now called Oak Meadows Estates. He called it what it had always been, his land. He'd bought the property in 1973 when you could still drive 10 miles without seeing a stoplight. Back then, folks waved from tractors, not Teslas. The little red barn behind his house was older than he was. He'd kept it upright with a few boards, some stubbornness, and the same hammer he'd used in the Army Corps of Engineers. His daughter once joked that if the barn ever fell, the rest of Texas would list to the side. These days he lived a retired man's rhythm. Coffee at 6, radio talk shows till 8, tinkering in the shed till lunch. In the evenings he'd drive into town, pick up supplies, and maybe chat with the clerk at the feed store about the weather or whatever city council idea was making people roll their eyes that week. It was a quiet, simple life. He didn't need much, just his truck, his land, and his peace. But peace in Oak Meadows was a limited-time offer. The subdivision's homeowners association had formed 5 years back when the new phase of houses popped up like mushrooms after rain. They weren't bad people exactly, Walt thought, just convinced the world ran better on rules and clipboards. Every month they sent out glossy newsletters about community pride and aesthetic unity. He mostly used them to line the chicken coop. One Tuesday morning, he heard the mail truck rattle up his gravel drive. The mail lady gave a polite nod and slid a thick white envelope into the box. It had the HOA logo on the corner, 2 oak leaves hugging a watercolor fountain. He frowned. The only time he'd ever heard from them before was a misaddressed newsletter. He tore the envelope open while still leaning against the mailbox. Inside was a letter with a friendly font and a tone that managed to sound both polite and threatening. Dear property owner, it began. As part of our community beautification initiative, we are conducting compliance reviews of all visible structures that impact the neighborhood's aesthetic cohesion. He had to stop and laugh at that. Aesthetic cohesion. They made it sound like his barn had committed a felony. The letter went on about legacy structures and non-conforming designs, then offered him a courtesy notice to bring his property into alignment. If he didn't, fines could apply. Walt folded the letter neatly, walked back to the porch, and set it beside his coffee. He looked out at his field, golden grass swaying, the barn's paint flaking in the sun, a hawk drifting over the tree line. It looked just fine to him. Maybe the HOA thought it was an eyesore, but to him it was the last honest view in the county. Later that afternoon, his neighbor Ed Sims came by. Ed had one of those lawns so precise you could measure it with a ruler. He wore white sneakers, tucked in polo, and that slightly worried look of someone always checking for rules to follow. Hey Walt, Ed said, glancing around like someone might overhear. You get a letter too? Sure did, Walt said. Says my barn's messing up their view. Ed nodded grimly. They're serious, Walt. They fined the Thompsons last year for having garden gnomes. Said it encouraged clutter. Clutter, Walt repeated. Guess they've never seen a government office. Ed chuckled nervously. You know how they are. I just pay the dues and keep quiet. That was the difference between them. Ed believed in not making trouble. Walt believed that trouble was what you got when you let other people do your thinking. That night, Walt called his daughter Kelly in Dallas. She was a real estate lawyer, sharp as a tack and twice as quick. Dad, she said after he read the letter aloud. They can't fine you. You're not even part of the HOA. Your parcel's separate. You were there before the development. Try telling them that, he said. They think they own half the county. Well, you've got your deed, right? Walt smiled. In the same drawer as my tax receipts from '78. Kelly laughed. Then don't worry. Just keep the letter. These people run on fear and paper. You've got both beat. The next morning, Walt put the letter on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a cow. Every time he poured coffee, he looked at it and shook his head. The absurdity of it almost made him admire their nerve. Somewhere in an air-conditioned office, someone had decided that his weathered barn, the one he'd repaired through 3 droughts and 1 tornado, didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic cohesion. A week later, the HOA newsletter arrived, and there it was, a paragraph about expanding community development, revitalizing underused properties, and integrating future commercial opportunities. He noticed a line that made his jaw tighten. The association is exploring acquisition and rezoning options for adjacent lots to support a proposed retail plaza. He reread that line 3 times. Adjacent lots, that meant him. Over the next few days, strange survey flags appeared near his fence. Neon orange and pink plastic flapping in the breeze. He watched from the porch as 2 men in reflective vests planted stakes and scribbled notes. When he asked what they were doing, one said, "Preliminary assessment for Oak Meadows Plaza, sir." "Funny," Walt said. "Don't remember selling this land." They just smiled and kept working. By Friday, the flags stretched halfway across his pasture. He didn't get mad, not yet. He just went inside, pulled out his old file box, and laid his papers on the kitchen table. Warranty deed, tax assessments, property surveys, all neat as a sermon. He knew the lines of his land better than the lines on his hand. That weekend, Marcia Klein herself showed up. HOA president, mid-40s, hair so tight it could file paperwork by itself. She had 2 board members in tow and a clipboard full of initiative summaries. "Mr. Henderson," she said with a practiced smile, "I'm sure you've heard about our plans to modernize the community perimeter. The board is very excited about integrating your lot into our growth vision." "My lot," he said slowly, "ain't a Lego block." She laughed like he'd told a joke she didn't understand. "We're offering generous compensation, of course. You'll be pleased." He folded his arms. "Lady, I'm already pleased." Her smile stiffened. "The association has certain rights to ensure neighborhood integrity. It would be unfortunate to have legal misunderstandings." "Unfortunate for who?" She blinked, as if she hadn't considered that direction. "We'll be in touch." When she left, Walt went back to the porch, poured another cup of coffee, and watched her SUV disappear down the road. He didn't know what game they were playing, but he'd played longer. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, listening to crickets and flipping through old folders. He came across the original plat map, yellowed but clear. His land sat entirely outside the HOA boundary. Legally, it was its own island. They could build their malls and fountains all they wanted, but not on his dirt. He felt that old army calm settle in, the kind that comes before a storm. There was no anger, just certainty. Bureaucrats liked to think paper was power. But he had better paper, older paper, the kind with signatures that meant something. The next morning, he drove into town, made a few copies at the county office, and slipped them into a new binder labeled Henderson Property Active. When the clerk asked if he was planning to sell, he smiled and said, "Not yet. I might just lease it to them for laughs." By Monday, another letter arrived, thicker this time, printed in bold. Final notice of compliance opportunity. The HOA gave him 30 days to remove or relocate all non-conforming structures. He read it once, poured himself another cup, and pinned it right next to the first one on the fridge. Outside, the sprinklers hissed, the sun climbed over the roof lines, and the sound of distant construction drifted across the fields. Walt leaned back in his chair, feeling that quiet satisfaction that comes right before something truly stupid happens. He looked at the letter one more time and murmured, "Well, that's new." Then he smiled, because he knew one thing for sure. That letter changed everything. The first real skirmish started with a clipboard. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that already felt sticky before the sun cleared the rooftops. Walt was in his barn replacing a hinge when he heard tires crunch on his gravel drive. He stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag, and there they were, 3 HOA board members marching toward him like a code enforcement SWAT team. Marcia led the charge, visor on, clipboard ready, 2 men trailing behind in matching polo shirts that looked too new to have ever seen dirt. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," she said, cheerful as a dentist. "We're conducting our follow-up inspection." "Inspection of what?" he asked. leaning on the fence. Your property's compliance with community development standards. He smiled thinly. You mean my land? Her grin didn't flicker. We prefer to think of it as our shared visual environment. Behind her, one of the men was taking pictures of his barn, another scribbling something on a notepad. Walt watched for a moment, then said, You get my good side? The photographer looked startled. Marcia cleared her throat. Mr. Henderson, your barn and fencing fall outside the approved material and color standards outlined in Section 4B of our community covenant. Furthermore, your property line vegetation has exceeded acceptable height limits. Vegetation, Walt repeated. You mean the pecan tree? She glanced up. It obstructs uniform sight lines. Ma'am, Walt said, that tree's older than your subdivision. It's staying. Marcia sighed, like she pitied him. We're trying to maintain harmony here. It's important for property values. Walt looked out at the cul-de-sac, where half the driveways had oil stains and one house still had Christmas lights sagging in June. You think my tree's the problem? Her smile vanished for half a second. I'll note your response, she said briskly, and the group moved back toward their SUV. By that evening, Walt had a citation in his mailbox. $100 daily fine for noncompliance with community aesthetic standards. The fine would continue to accrue until corrective action was verified. He chuckled and tacked it next to the other letters on the fridge. The door was starting to look like a gallery exhibit titled Paperwork and Nonsense. He told his neighbor Ed about it that night when he stopped by with a six-pack. Ed winced like Walt had announced a terminal illness. You're in it now, he said. Once they start fining, they don't stop. Ed, Walt said, they can't fine me. I'm not in their HOA. Ed shrugged. They fined my cousin once for painting his porch red. Said it didn't fit the palette. What did he do? Painted it beige. Twice. Walt took a long sip of beer. Guess that explains why his porch looks miserable. A few days later, Walt was working in the field when a tow truck rolled up. He squinted against the sun as a young guy hopped out, chewing gum. Here to remove an unauthorized vehicle, sir, the kid said. What vehicle? The kid pointed to Walt's tractor. That's a 1968 Massey Ferguson, Walt said. Been parked there since Nixon was in office. The kid checked his clipboard. Says here, non-operational vehicle visible from the roadway. Walt laughed so hard he had to lean against the fence. Son, this tractor's more operational than your boss's brain. The kid hesitated. Look, I just get paid to tow. Then get paid somewhere else. The boy backed off when Walt mentioned he'd call the sheriff. The tow truck left in a hurry, dust rising behind it. Walt stood there shaking his head, still smiling. The absurdity was starting to amuse him more than annoy him. That weekend, he drove into town to buy nails and stopped at the diner. A few locals were gathered at the counter, talking about the HOA. You hear they're putting in a plaza? Someone said. Mall, food court, even a fitness center. Walt raised an eyebrow. Where? Out by Oak Meadows, right near that old farm. What's his name, Henderson? Walt sipped his coffee. You don't say. The rumors multiplied faster than mosquitoes. By Monday, he'd heard there was a business park proposal, then a community recreation hub, each version bigger than the last. He didn't say a word, just kept mowing his field, keeping his records, and watching the little flags spread. That afternoon, Marcia sent another letter, this one more formal. Notice of noncompliance escalation. It mentioned potential lien proceedings and future development integration. Walt underlined the phrase integration 3 times with a red pen. He found it impressive how many fancy words they could use to describe trespassing. He decided to pay them a visit. The next evening, Walt showed up at the monthly HOA meeting. It was held in a beige community center with folding chairs and the smell of donuts gone stale. About 30 residents filled the room. Marcia sat at the front table under a banner that read Oak Meadows, a vision for tomorrow. When Walt walked in, heads turned. Someone whispered, That's the farmer. He took a seat in the back, folded his arms, and listened. The agenda covered lawn uniformity, approved fence heights, and the annual 4th of July barbecue menu, no charcoal allowed, for air quality consistency. Finally, Marcia moved to new business. As you all know, she said, her tone glowing with self-importance, our expansion project for Oak Meadows Plaza is underway. We're very close to finalizing the development phase. A woman raised her hand. Is that the shopping area by Mr. Henderson's place? Marcia's smile didn't waver. Yes, that's correct. We're currently negotiating land usage. Negotiate's a big word, Walt said from the back. The room went silent. Marcia blinked. Mr. Henderson, welcome. We've reached out to you several times. I've noticed, he said. You might want to check your map before you build a mall on someone else's dirt. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Marcia's cheeks colored slightly. Our legal team has reviewed everything, Mr. Henderson. We're operating fully within our jurisdiction. Well, Walt said, standing up. Then your legal team's using crayons. A few people stifled laughs. Marcia's jaw tightened. We'll continue this discussion privately. No need, Walt said. Just wanted to make sure you all knew. That land's mine, and your bulldozers are about 3 fence posts too far west. He tipped his hat and walked out. Behind him, he heard whispers and one small clap before the door shut. The next morning, a new sign appeared by his driveway. Future site of Oak Meadows Plaza, grand opening coming soon. Walt stared at it for a long moment, then laughed so hard he had to sit on his porch steps. He took a picture and sent it to Kelly with the message. They're building confidence faster than concrete. Kelly called immediately. Dad, this is beyond ridiculous. You want me to send them a cease and desist? Not yet, he said. I'm curious to see how deep they'll dig their own hole. Within a week, construction trucks began rumbling down the road. Survey crews, concrete mixers, even a portable restroom appeared near the edge of his field. Walt watched them from his porch like a man observing wildlife. The whole operation had the energy of children playing store. Loud, confident, and utterly sure they were in charge. Every night, he wrote notes in his binder. Dates, company names, equipment on site. When he wasn't documenting, he was grinning. The more they built, the better his case became. One evening, Ed stopped by again. You really gonna let them build on your land? He asked. Let's call it an investment, Walt said. In what? In karma. Ed shook his head. You're playing with fire. Good thing I own the water rights. By now, the HOA had doubled his fines and plastered his name on their internal bulletins as a non-compliant holdout. Neighbors whispered when he drove by. Some thought he was crazy. Others quietly rooted for him. He could feel the split in the air, half suburbia, half old Texas grit. On a hot Friday afternoon, Walt got another letter, this one thicker than all the rest. Notice of intent to acquire easement rights for community development purposes. He read it slowly, every line more absurd than the last. They were claiming partial eminent domain through community enhancement justification. He leaned back in his chair, whistling low. Well, I'll be, he said to the empty room. They're trying to play government. He poured himself a cold tea, walked outside, and looked across his land. The bulldozers were parked in the distance, their yellow sides catching the evening sun. It was an absurd sight, an army of machines building dreams on borrowed dirt. He felt no rage, only calm certainty. The kind that comes from knowing something the other side doesn't. They could build every wall, lay every brick, and file every smug report, but none of it would matter. Because when the dust settled, he'd still have the deed. He smiled, adjusted his hat, and whispered to himself, Keep building, folks. You're making my payday bigger. Then he turned, walked back to the porch, and watched the sprinklers rise again. Steady, defiant, and perfectly in rhythm. He didn't know how far they'd push it, but he was sure of one thing. They hadn't seen the last of him. And somewhere between the hiss of the sprinklers and the hum of the bulldozers, he couldn't help but laugh. The petty war had begun, and it was about to get beautifully stupid. The night the bulldozers moved closer than ever, Walt sat at his kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, and the quiet hum of the radio in the background. The local host was rambling about property taxes, but his mind was somewhere else, on the glow of the construction lights just beyond his window. He could see them from his porch now, bright as a football field, turning his pasture into a crime scene. It wasn't anger that filled him. It was curiosity. He wanted to see how far they'd go before someone realized they were knee-deep in someone else's land. Kelly had been calling every night, half lawyer, half daughter. "Dad," she'd say, "document everything. Don't stop them yet. Every nail they drive makes your case stronger." He'd smile at her confidence. She got that sharp edge from her mother. "I'm not stopping him," he said that evening. "I'm just watching. They're building my retirement bonus, one cinder block at a time." By morning, he'd made his decision. No shouting, no confrontation, no protest signs. The real power wasn't in noise, it was in paper. Walt had spent a lifetime dealing with maps, plats, and property lines. As a land surveyor, he'd been the one drawing the invisible borders that towns were built on. He knew the difference between a fence line and a legal line, and right now those bulldozers were on the wrong side of both. He drove to the county recorder's office, the same one where his deed had been filed in 1973. The clerk, a woman with half-moon glasses and a patience honed by bureaucracy, looked up as he walked in. "Morning, Mr. Henderson," she said. "Haven't seen you in a spell. Just need a few copies," he said, setting down a list. "Everything with my parcel number since the Nixon years." She raised an eyebrow. "You planning on selling?" "Nope. Just curious what the neighbors think they're doing." He spent 2 hours there, leafing through files, tracing maps, and highlighting parcel boundaries. Every line confirmed what he already knew. The HOA had zero jurisdiction. His land was its own separate lot, recorded and taxed independently. He walked out with a folder thick enough to flatten a snake. Back home, he started organizing it all, every survey, deed, and legal description, into a binder labeled Henderson versus Idiocy. The name made him laugh. He added photographs of the construction creeping onto his property and printed screenshots of the county GIS map, complete with GPS coordinates. Then came the best part. He opened his filing cabinet and pulled out a small metal box. Inside were years of receipts, taxes, maintenance, insurance. He stacked them neatly in the binder. Anyone could own land, he thought, but it took a real man to prove it 50 ways from Sunday. By the second week, the noise from the site grew constant. Hammering, shouting, beeping trucks. The HOA had partnered with a developer now, some local outfit with big promises and bigger egos. A temporary banner flapped over the site entrance. "Oak Meadows Plaza, coming summer 2025. He grinned. "Perfect," he muttered. "Plenty of time to hang themselves." When Ed came over that afternoon, he found Walt sitting on the tailgate of his truck, watching the chaos like it was television. "You're enjoying this," Ed said, shaking his head. "Sure am. It's like watching a slow-motion car wreck where the driver's reading a map upside down." "They're saying the new mall's gonna raise property values," Ed offered. "For who? Me?" Ed looked uneasy. "Marcia says they're within their rights." "Marcia says a lot of things," Walt said. "Most of 'em wrong." That night, Walt called Kelly again and told her about the new construction push. She listened quietly, then said, "All right, Dad. Time to get strategic. Don't tell them a word. Let them keep spending. When they're done, we file the claim." He liked that plan, simple, silent, devastating. "You think they'll even realize?" "Not until a judge explains it to them," she said. The next morning, he printed a fresh copy of his property map, laminated it, and nailed it to the inside of his barn door. It wasn't for show. It was a reminder to himself that calm and patience were his best weapons. Weeks passed. The site transformed from open dirt to foundations. They paved part of his field, poured concrete, and laid rebar so close to his fence, he could hear the metal hum when trucks rumbled by. The workers waved sometimes, he waved back. No reason to make enemies with the hired hands. They were just following orders from people who'd never stepped in mud deeper than their loafers. Marcia, meanwhile, kept up appearances. Every few days, she'd drive past in her SUV, slowing down just long enough to glare. He always tipped his hat. Once, he saw her gesturing to a man in a suit, pointing toward his barn as if explaining some grand vision. He imagined her saying, "We'll put the loading dock right there." He found it funny how people could be so certain while standing on borrowed land. One afternoon, while checking the fence line, he found a surveyor setting up a tripod. The young man smiled nervously. "Afternoon, sir. Just marking lot boundaries." "Whose boundaries?" Walt asked. "Oak Meadows Development," the man said. "Mind checking your coordinates again?" Walt said, handing him a folded map. "You're 40 feet inside my property." The man frowned at the map, then at his equipment. That can't be right." "Sure can," Walt said. "You see that post? That's the county marker. Been there since '58. You're standing on Henderson land, son." The surveyor swallowed hard. I'll let my supervisor know." "Good idea," Walt said. "Tell him to bring lunch. I'll be here all day." The kid packed up fast. Walt chuckled, shaking his head. They'd built half a parking lot without realizing it sat on the wrong side of the line. Every day, their mistake got pricier. He decided to up his game. He started keeping a log, photos, timestamps, truck license plates. Kelly called it building the hammer. When she asked if he wanted to send a preliminary notice, he said, "Nope. The longer they dance, the louder the crash." By mid-spring, the plaza was taking shape: steel beams, framed walls, and a big signboard listing future tenants. Coffee spot, nail bar, pet groomer, Oak Meadows Realty. Walt nearly choked on his iced tea when he saw that last one. They were literally opening an office to sell property on top of his. The irony was delicious. That weekend, he invited Ed over for barbecue. As they sat on lawn chairs, smoke rising from the grill, Walt nodded toward the construction site. "You know," he said, "they built that whole storm drain on my side. Probably cost a fortune." Ed frowned. "You're not really gonna sue, are you?" "Not yet," Walt said. "I'm just letting them improve the property for me. Feels like poking a bear." Walt grinned. "Nah, I'm the bear." That night, he sat on his porch, looking out at the half-finished plaza glowing under floodlights. He thought about all the times he'd heard people say you can't fight the system. Maybe that was true if you shouted at it. But if you let the system trap itself in its own paperwork, that was a different story. The next week, he took his binder down to the county courthouse and had every document officially certified. When the clerk asked what it was for, he just said, "Insurance." Back home, he placed the binder on his kitchen table like a trophy. The construction noise rumbled through the windows, shaking the coffee cups in the cabinet. He didn't mind. Every vibration meant progress. Every progress meant proof. He started keeping a running tally in his notebook. Estimated construction cost to date, $8.2 million. He smiled when he wrote it. The higher that number climbed, the sweeter his day of reckoning would be. By late summer, the mall skeleton was complete. Marcia and her board took glossy photos for the community newsletter. The caption read, "Oak Meadows Plaza, a vision becoming reality." When the newsletter landed in Walt's mailbox, he tore it open and looked at the picture. His red barn was in the background. The photo's caption made him laugh out loud. "New beginnings on the edge of progress." He pinned that picture right next to the HOA letters on his fridge, took a step back and admired the collection. It looked like a timeline of arrogance. As he sat down with his evening coffee, the hum of construction fading into night, he felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not vengeance, but quiet satisfaction. They had no idea what was coming. They'd built their dream on his dirt, and soon enough, the paperwork would do what bulldozers couldn't. He looked out over the dark field, the silhouettes of beams and machines standing like monuments to foolishness, and whispered to himself, "Keep building. Every brick's just another receipt." He smiled, finished his coffee, and turned out the light. They had no idea what was coming. The day the grand opening banners went up, Walt nearly spilled his coffee laughing. There it was in 10-foot letters stretched across the new glass facade. Oak Meadows Plaza, shop, dine, thrive. They even had a little ribbon graphic underneath it, the kind of thing you'd see on a small-town parade float. The parking lot sparkled with fresh paint, flower beds lined the sidewalks, and the whole thing gleamed like a monument to self-congratulation. From his porch, Walt could hear the buzz of a local radio station setting up for a live broadcast. It was all so absurd that it felt like a sitcom written by people who'd never met a farmer. He put on his hat, climbed into his truck, and drove down to watch the festivities. Nobody stopped him. The construction barriers were gone now, and the lot was open. He parked right where his old pecan tree's roots ran under the asphalt and leaned against his fender. There were food trucks, a bounce house, even a man in a foam mascot suit shaped like an acorn. The mayor had shown up, cutting a ribbon while Marcia Klein smiled beside him, radiating triumph. Walt had to give her credit. She'd pulled off the illusion perfectly. He stood there, unseen in the crowd, watching as the flashbulbs popped and the crowd clapped. The band struck up something cheerful and hollow. Kids ran past him carrying balloons. He could have walked right up and ruined the show, but that wasn't his way. His moment wasn't now. It was coming soon, and he wanted every camera pointed in the right direction when it happened. About half an hour into the ceremony, Marcia spotted him. Her expression froze mid-smile. For a second, she looked like she'd seen a ghost of common sense. Then she quickly turned back to the microphone, announcing, "And now, with gratitude to our sponsors and community partners, Oak Meadows Plaza is officially open for business." The ribbon dropped. Applause. Confetti. Cameras. That was the exact moment the courier walked up the steps carrying a long white envelope. He tapped Marcia's shoulder and handed it to her. She blinked in confusion, tore it open, and her face drained of color. Walt didn't need to see the words to know what it said. He'd written part of that letter himself. It was a notice of unlawful encroachment and cease occupancy, signed by the county clerk and delivered at exactly 10:03 a.m., the same minute she'd cut her ribbon. The letter ordered an immediate halt to all operations until property ownership could be verified. Walt watched as she scanned the page again, then again. She looked up, eyes darting across the crowd. The microphone squealed. Just a quick moment, folks. Small, administrative issue." The mayor leaned over, whispering. Reporters smelled blood. Cameras zoomed in. The crowd murmured. Walt couldn't resist. He tipped his hat and called out, "Check your map, ma'am. Might be you built your dream a little too far west." The laughter that rippled through the onlookers was quiet but sharp, like wind chimes in a storm. Someone from the radio crew muttered, "What's he mean by that?" And another whispered, "That's the farmer they fought with." Within 10 minutes, the party turned into chaos. Board members gathered around Marcia like nervous hens, flipping through folders, making calls, arguing over who had the latest survey. Walt sat on the hood of his truck, sipping coffee, the picture of calm amusement. By noon, sheriff's deputies had arrived, not to arrest anyone, but to serve an official injunction to pause all commercial activity until the dispute was resolved. The mall's automatic doors were locked, the band packed up, and the crowd drifted away murmuring. He couldn't have scripted it better. That afternoon, Marcia's SUV rolled into his driveway, dust flying. She stepped out, sunglasses hiding most of her face but not the panic in her voice. "Mr. Henderson," she said, "we need to talk." "Afternoon," Walt replied. "Enjoy the ceremony?" She glared. "This is harassment. You can't just..." He held up a hand. "You're standing on my property, Marcia. I can do quite a bit." For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she sighed, the sound of someone realizing the universe might not revolve around them. "Look," she said, "we can make this right. A settlement, a buyout, whatever you want. But please, drop the injunction." Walt took a slow sip of coffee, savoring it. "Ma'am, I don't want your money. I want you to learn how to read a deed." Her jaw tightened. "This development represents years of work. Investors will be thrilled," he interrupted. "You'll have plenty to explain at the next meeting." That was when one of the deputies approached, holding another envelope. "Ma'am," he said, "you've been officially served. County clerk's office says construction permits are void pending review. The look on her face was priceless. A mix of disbelief and fury. The exact expression of someone who just realized they'd spent millions decorating another man's backyard. She spun toward Walt, voice rising. You planned this. He smiled faintly. Took a little patience. But yeah. She stomped back to her SUV and peeled away, gravel spitting under the tires. Walt leaned against the fence and chuckled to himself. He could already imagine the panic spreading through the HOA office like spilled coffee. Phones ringing, board members blaming each other, lawyers scrambling. By sunset, the local news had picked up the story. Legal dispute halts opening of Oak Meadows Plaza. The headline alone made him laugh out loud. The reporter stood outside the gates, microphone in hand, saying words like zoning oversight, property line confusion, and unconfirmed legal claims. Walt didn't bother calling in a comment. He preferred letting the facts speak. That night, his phone buzzed with messages. Neighbors cheering him on. A few nervous ones asking if their own homes were safe. Ed called two, half-whispering like they were in a spy movie. Walt, it's all over the neighborhood page. They're saying you own half the parking lot. 40%, Walt corrected. But who's counting? Ed laughed nervously. You're a legend, man. Marcia's losing her mind. They're having an emergency board meeting tonight. Wish them luck, Walt said. When he hung up, he sat quietly for a while, the kind of silence that only comes after a long game played perfectly. He'd waited months for this. Every letter, every insult, every flag they'd planted. All of it had led here. And yet, even in victory, there was a trace of melancholy. He didn't hate his neighbors. Most of them were decent folks just trying to keep up with whatever new nonsense the board invented. His fight wasn't with them. It was with arrogance, the kind that wore a smile and carried a clipboard. The next morning, the news vans arrived. They parked at the entrance. Cameras pointed toward the shiny mall that was now taped off with yellow notice of investigation signs. Walt stayed on his porch, listening to the hum of reporters asking questions nobody wanted to answer. One of them finally spotted him and walked up the drive. Mr. Henderson, Channel 7 News, the reporter said. Is it true part of the mall sits on your property? Walt looked up from his paper. Son, it's not part of it. It's the good part. The reporter grinned. What happens next? Well, Walt said, folding his newspaper. I reckon they'll start reading the fine print they should have read before they poured concrete. He could almost hear Kelly's laughter all the way from Dallas when he told her later. She'd been tracking the legal filings online, preparing the next steps. Dad, she said, the HOA's attorney just filed a motion to dismiss your claim. You know what that means? Means they're desperate. Exactly. Hold steady. We'll get the county to confirm your boundary next week. And then the real fun begins. He nodded, proud and amused. You're turning into a mean little lawyer. Apple doesn't fall far from the stubborn old tree, she said. That evening, Walt went for a slow drive through town. He passed the mall entrance where workers were dismantling the stage, balloon strings fluttering across the asphalt. A few reporters still lingered, hoping for a quote from the elusive farmer at the heart of the scandal. He didn't stop. He just rolled down the window, tipped his hat, and kept going. At the diner, folks bought him coffee all night. One man slapped him on the shoulder and said, You're a hero, Walt. Stick it to those HOA bullies. Another whispered, Heard the investors are threatening to sue Marcia. Walt just smiled. Sounds like progress to me. Back home, he walked the property line under the stars. The lights from the half-built plaza glowed pale across the fields. But for the first time in months, he didn't feel crowded. The land was quiet again, his land, and soon everyone would have to admit it. He stood there a long time, hands in his pockets, the smell of warm asphalt drifting on the wind. A coyote yipped somewhere out past the creek, and he smiled. It was a good sound, natural, honest. He turned toward the barn, glanced once more at the bright mall sign still fluttering uselessly in the dark, and thought to himself, they really should have read the map before they paved it. Then, with a soft laugh and the calm of a man who'd already won, he went inside, turned off the porch light, and let the night settle over Oak Meadows, quiet except for the distant hum of panic from the boardroom down the road. 2 days after the injunction froze the mall, the HOA's meeting minutes leaked onto Facebook. Walt didn't have to read them. Half the county was quoting them at the diner by breakfast. Phrases like liability exposure, unauthorized jurisdiction, and immediate legal review floated through the gossip like dandelion seeds. Marcia Klein, once the queen of cul-de-sacs, was now the most unpopular woman in Oak Meadows. Walt wasn't gloating exactly. He was waiting. Kelly had told him the next move needed to come from their side, clean and professional. So when her SUV rolled up the driveway one Thursday morning, he was already on the porch with coffee, a folder, and a grin. "Morning, counselor," he said. She kissed his cheek, looked around, and smiled at the sight of the silent, empty plaza beyond the trees. "Still can't believe they built a mall on your land," she said. "Believe it," he said. "They paved paradise and forgot to check the paperwork." She laughed, shaking her head. "All right, Dad. Today's the big one. We're going to their lawyer's office to talk settlement. No yelling, no folksy parables about common sense. Just facts, deeds, and signatures." "Kelly," he said, "I don't yell. I narrate." The law office was everything you'd expect. Chrome, glass, and a lobby that smelled like rich people's anxiety. A young assistant led them into a conference room where Marcia sat flanked by 2 men in dark suits. The moment Walt walked in, she looked like someone who'd bitten into a lemon. "Mr. Henderson," one of the lawyers said, standing. "Thank you for coming. We believe there's been a boundary misunderstanding." Walt set his binder on the table with a thud that made the pens jump. "Misunderstanding," he repeated. "That's one way to spell trespass." Kelly opened the binder, sliding forward the certified plats. "My father's property line extends 42 feet past the current edge of your development. That means roughly 40% of your mall, including the anchor building and a drainage system, sits squarely on his deeded land." The older lawyer cleared his throat. "Our survey indicates." "Your survey," Kelly interrupted, "was based on pre-annexation county data from 1989, which excluded Parcel 7C. My father owns 7C. You built across the recorded easement without permission." Marcia's voice cracked. "That can't be right." Walt slid a photo across the table, construction crews pouring concrete around his fence post, his mailbox visible in the corner. "It's right, and the county recorder certified it last week." Silence, the kind that hums. The younger attorney shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Henderson, our client would like to resolve this amicably." "Amicably's fine," Walt said, "as long as we all read the same dictionary." Kelly leaned forward. "Here's our proposal. Immediate payment for the full appraised value of the occupied land, plus damages, legal costs, and a courtesy naming clause. Total settlement, $3.5 million. Marcia gasped. Are you insane?" Kelly smiled sweetly. "Actually, that's conservative. You can check the county appraisals yourself. Construction on private land without a lease falls under unlawful occupation. You'd lose 10 times that if this went to court." The older lawyer rubbed his temple. "We'll need time to discuss this with our clients." "Take your time," Walt said. "You seem to like building on borrowed ground." By the following week, they called back. The HOA's investors were folding fast. No one wanted their names on a lawsuit with illegal construction in the title. The settlement was signed quietly, without press releases or cameras. Walt received the wire transfer, and within days the plaza's name changed to Henderson Square. The first time he saw the new sign go up, he laughed until he cried. "Never thought I'd see the day my name was on a mall," he said. "Does that make me a developer?" "Technically," Kelly said. "It makes you a landlord. They're paying you rent. Remember?" He couldn't stop smiling. News of the reversal spread through the community like wildfire. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact now waved from their driveways. Someone left a thank you note on his mailbox that said, "You stood up for all of us who couldn't." Even Ed came over with a peace offering, a cherry pie and a sheepish grin. "Guess you really showed him," Ed said. Didn't show him anything they couldn't have seen on a map, Walt replied. Still, Ed said, glancing toward the mall. I bet Marcia's steamed. She'll cool off, Walt said. Concrete takes a while to crack. That evening, the local news ran a new story. Small-town farmer wins big in HOA land dispute. Walt didn't like the farmer label much. He'd been a surveyor longer than a farmer, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction of hearing it out loud. The anchor ended the segment with a smile. Sometimes, the little guy with the right paperwork still wins. He turned off the TV, stepped onto his porch, and looked out at the plaza. The parking lot lights shimmered over the asphalt that now legally paid him monthly rent. His barn door creaked in the breeze, the same barn the HOA once called non-compliant. He walked over, placed his hand on the old wood, and said softly, "Still standing, old friend." Inside the barn, on the back wall, hung the original future site of Oak Meadows Plaza sign they'd once nailed to his fence. He'd taken it down himself and kept it as a souvenir. Next to it, he pinned the newspaper clipping about his victory. The two hung side by side like bookends of poetic justice. A week later, Marcia resigned as HOA president. The new board sent Walt an apologetic letter signed by all members, promising a new era of cooperation and community respect. He framed that one too. But the victory wasn't about money or revenge. For Walt, it was about proving that decency didn't mean weakness. You didn't have to shout to win, you just had to know your ground, literally and legally. That fall, Kelly visited again, bringing her kids this time. They played tag around the field while Walt grilled burgers on the porch. When his grandson asked, "Grandpa, is that your mall?" he laughed. "Part of it," he said. "They rent it from me now. Teaches folks to measure twice before they pour concrete." As the sun dipped low, he leaned back in his chair and listened to the evening sounds. The buzz of crickets, the hum of traffic from his parking lot, and the faint chime of laughter from his family. The land felt at peace again. Later that night, he went to close the barn door and paused to look at the lights across the field. The mall sign gleamed Henderson Square in bright white letters. Beneath it, shoppers came and went, none of them realizing that every step they took was on land that once belonged to a man everyone tried to push aside. He smiled, not out of spite but out of something cleaner, vindication mixed with amusement. All the months of silence, patience, and paperwork had paid off. The HOA had learned their lesson in the only language they respected: liability. He sat back down at the kitchen table, pulled the last letter they'd ever sent him from the fridge, and read it again for fun. Final notice of compliance opportunity. The words still made him chuckle. He took a pen and scribbled across the bottom in big block letters, "Paid in full." Then he slid it into a folder marked Lessons Learned and tucked it away. Before bed, he stepped outside one last time. The night was calm, the air cool. Out in the distance, the sprinklers clicked on, watering the grass that bordered the plaza, the grass that still belonged to him. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Not bad for an old man with a mailbox and a binder," he said quietly. Justice had been served, not by anger but by patience, not by shouting but by proof. The story was done, but the satisfaction lingered, slow and steady, like the hum of the sprinklers. He turned off the porch light, smiling as he did every night now. The world might be full of rules and committees and people with clipboards, but it still made room for one old land surveyor who knew exactly where the line was drawn, and what happened when others crossed it. By the time spring came around again, Oak Meadows Plaza had settled into its shiny new identity as Henderson Square, a name that still made Walt shake his head every time he drove past it. The letters gleamed silver in the Texas sunlight, bold and permanent, like they'd always belonged there. Funny thing, he thought, how something that began as arrogance had turned into a monument to humility. He drove into town one afternoon to buy feed, and the girl at the counter, young, polite, probably fresh out of high school, handed him his receipt with a grin. "You're the guy with the mall, right?" He laughed. "That's one way to put it. My dad says you beat the HOA. He said it was the best thing to happen to this county since the drive-in reopened." "Tell your dad it wasn't a beating," Walt said, pocketing his change. It was more of a gentle correction. When he left the store, he noticed a small group of people by the bulletin board outside. Someone had pinned up a flyer, "Community Meeting, Future of the HOA." It had a picture of smiling board members who looked far less confident than they used to. He didn't go, of course. He didn't need to. He'd already made his point the old-fashioned way, by standing still while everyone else ran in circles. Back home, the world had gone back to its old rhythm. The field was green again. The air smelled of honeysuckle and wet soil, and the only letters in his mailbox these days were junk coupons. The barn leaned the same way it always had, but now it looked less like an eyesore and more like a landmark. The locals had even started calling it the barn that beat the board. Walt thought that was silly, but secretly he didn't mind. One morning, he was out fixing a loose hinge when Ed Sims pulled up in his SUV. Ed had been one of those neighbors who'd stayed quiet through the whole ordeal, watching from behind the blinds. Now he looked different, relieved, almost friendly. "Morning, Walt," he said. "Got a minute?" "Always do." Ed stepped out holding a coffee mug. "They held elections last night. Marcia's out for good. New president says they're revising the bylaws. Less nonsense, more neighborly." "That'll be the day," Walt said, wiping his hands. "I mean it," Ed insisted. "They even talked about removing some of the petty stuff, the mailbox rules, the fence color charts, all of it." Walt smiled faintly. "Guess they learned something after all." Ed chuckled. "Learned they can't outpaper a man with a filing cabinet older than their subdivision." They talked for a while about weather, about the price of gas, about how the Plaza's coffee shop was actually pretty decent now that it wasn't under legal lockdown. When Ed drove off, Walt stayed by the fence, looking out at the horizon. The plaza shimmered in the distance, its neon signs faint against the morning haze. For a moment, he thought about the strange path that had led there. All the letters, the fines, the arguments, the sheer absurdity of being told what color a barn should be. He could still remember that first letter, folded neatly in an envelope that said, "Beautification Initiative." It had started like a mosquito bite, small, irritating, easy to ignore. Then it swelled into a full-blown storm. But storms pass. They always do. Later that week, Kelly and the kids came down for a visit. They wanted to see the famous mall, as the kids called it. Walt took them for ice cream at the corner shop, the one technically paying rent to him now. Watching his grandkids run around on the sidewalk, laughing, he couldn't help but feel that all the paperwork and patience had been worth it. Kelly leaned against the truck, smiling. "So, Dad, what are you going to do with all that settlement money?" He shrugged. "Haven't decided. Maybe buy a new truck. Maybe just fix the roof. Or you could finally take that fishing trip you always talk about." "Maybe," he said. "But then who'd keep an eye on the next HOA meeting?" She laughed. "You're incorrigible." "I'm retired," he said. "There's a difference." That evening they grilled burgers in the yard. The sound of crickets filled the air, and the lights from Henderson Square blinked lazily across the trees. The kids asked for stories, so he told them about the time he found a rattlesnake in his toolbox, and the time the barn nearly blew away in a storm. He didn't tell them about the legal battles or the fines. That wasn't the kind of story a kid needed. But he did tell them something true. "Life's funny," he said, poking the coals. "People think strength means shouting. But most of the time, it just means knowing when to keep your mouth shut and your papers organized." Kelly rolled her eyes, smiling. "That should be on a t-shirt." When they left the next morning, he stood by the gate waving until their car disappeared down the road. The land felt quiet again, peaceful, steady. The air smelled like rain. He looked out over the pasture where the sprinkler lines still ran and thought about how close he'd come to losing it all if he'd reacted in anger instead of patience. A week later, the new HOA board sent him an invitation. "Mr. Henderson, in recognition of your contribution to community integrity, we'd be honored if you'd attend our neighborhood appreciation luncheon." He laughed so hard he nearly dropped the letter. He didn't go, but he did send a note back. "Appreciate the thought. Keep the coffee hot and the rules short." By midsummer, life at Oak Meadows had achieved a strange harmony. The HOA was quieter, friendlier even. People painted their mailboxes whatever color they wanted, and nobody said a word. The plaza thrived under its new name, and not a single person complained about the old barn at the edge of town. Sometimes Walt would drive by and see folks sitting on the benches near the fountain, sipping coffee, feeding ducks in the retention pond, the same pond that, technically, still belonged to him. He never told them that part. Some secrets were too funny to spoil. In August, a local journalist stopped by for a follow-up interview. "So, Mr. Henderson," she asked, "what's the moral of your story?" He thought about it, rubbing his chin. "Simple," he said. "If you're gonna run the neighborhood, make sure you know where the neighborhood ends." The story aired on a Sunday night, and for a week people waved to him in the grocery store. But after that, life moved on. The headlines faded, the lawyers stopped calling, and Oak Meadows went back to being what it always should have been. A place where folks mowed their lawns, said hello at the mailbox, and minded their own business. Every once in a while, he'd still get a curious visitor. A stranger who'd heard the mall story. They'd stop by, shake his hand, and say, "You're the guy who outsmarted the HOA." He always laughed and said, "No, son, I just outweighted them." On one of those evenings, when the light turned gold and the sky stretched wide and forgiving, he sat on his porch watching the sprinklers tick in rhythm across the grass. He thought about his late wife, about the decades they'd spent building this little patch of peace. She would have loved the irony of it all, how patience and paperwork beat pride and power. He took a slow breath, savoring the smell of rain on dirt, the soft hum of distant traffic, and the quiet comfort of knowing everything was finally in its place. The world beyond his fence could keep spinning, arguing, legislating. He'd done his part. He picked up the old folder one last time. Inside was the very first HOA letter, yellowed at the edges. Across the top, in big, neat handwriting, he'd written, "Remember, always read the fine print." He slipped it back into the drawer and shut it for good. Before turning in, he looked out once more at the glow of the plaza sign in the distance, his accidental monument. The lights flickered gently in the dark, spelling out his name across land that had been his from the start. "Funny world," he murmured. "They tried to buy what was already bought, and I got paid to teach 'em manners." He smiled, turned off the porch light, and went inside. The night was warm, peaceful, and quiet except for one last whisper of water from the sprinklers. Steady, calm, and stubbornly on time, just like him. And if the world ever decided to send him another letter demanding he conform, Walt knew exactly what he'd do. He'd pour a cup of coffee, read it slow, and let the silence work its magic. Because you can't control the petty, but you sure as hell can outsmart it.